The wind, a relentless tormentor, whipped across the plains, tearing at Alara's thin dress and clawing at her exposed skin. She was an abomination, left for carrion, her substantial frame a public testament to her refusal. The rough hemp ropes bit into her wrists, fastened to a splintered fence post that stood like a skeletal finger against the bruised, indifferent sky. Her throat was raw from screaming, though she knew the sounds had been swallowed by the vast, empty expanse long before they reached any sympathetic ear. The town of Harmony's Promise, a cluster of sun-baked shacks barely visible on the horizon, had cast her out, a failed transaction, a defiant chattel. Her refusal to marry the brutish merchant, a man whose hands were as heavy as his purse, had sealed her fate. She's too much, they'd spat. Too much of a woman. Too much will. Too much flesh for a man who wants a docile wife. And so, they'd tied her, the fattest bride, to the fence, a public display of defiance broken. Her tears had dried hours ago, leaving salt trails on her dust-grimed cheeks. Now, there was only a hollow ache in her chest, a primal fear that tightened her diaphragm until each breath was a shallow gasp. The sun dipped, bleeding orange and purple into the gray, promising a night of bitter cold and the gnawing dread of what creatures the darkness might bring. She closed her eyes, wishing for unconsciousness, for oblivion. A shadow fell over her, vast and silent, cutting out the last sliver of twilight. Alara's eyes snapped open. A horse, dark as night, stood motionless, its rider a looming silhouette against the dying light. He was a man of the land, rugged and broad, his face obscured by the wide brim of a battered hat. He dismounted with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long solitude. No words, no exclamations of surprise or pity. He simply walked to her, his gaze unwavering. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Was this rescue, or was this the final, terrible chapter? He was a stranger, an outsider, the kind of man whispered about in hushed tones in Harmony's Promise, a widower, they said, who lived like a ghost on the edge of the territories, haunted by a past no one dared question. He smelled of wood smoke and leather, of the wild, untamed world that stretched endlessly around them. Without a word, he produced a heavy hunting knife, its blade glinting in the fading light. Alara flinched, bracing for the inevitable, but the blade was not aimed at her. With slow, deliberate movements he cut the ropes. Not gently, not with concern, but with the practical precision of a man dispatching a chore. Her wrists, raw and chafed, were suddenly free, but her limbs, stiff from hours of immobility, buckled beneath her. She collapsed to her knees, a gasp escaping her lips. He made no move to help her up, merely watched, his eyes unreadable. Then he stooped, not to offer a hand, but to scoop her up with surprising ease. Alara gasped, a cry caught in her throat. She was heavy, yes, she knew that, had always known that, but he lifted her as if she were no more than a child, settling her onto the back of his horse before swinging himself up behind her. She was wedged between his solid form and the horse's broad back, the faint scent of him enveloping her. He picked up the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, the horse began to move, carrying her away from the fence, away from Harmony's Promise, into the deepening unknown night. Alara looked back once, at the fence post, stark and lonely, then clung to the pommel, her mind reeling, her future a blank, terrifying canvas. The journey was a crucible of silence. Days blurred into a monotonous rhythm of riding, stopping only when the sun demanded rest or the horses needed water. Silas, as she'd come to know him by instinct, never spoke. His presence was a constant, formidable anchor. Alara, initially paralyzed by fear and confusion, slowly began to observe him. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, yet there was no malice in his actions. He shared his meager rations, offering her dried meat and hardtack, placing a filled canteen within her reach without ever meeting her gaze. He built fires that burned low and efficient, their warmth a small comfort against the biting desert nights. When they made camp, He would simply spread a canvas sheet for her, then unroll his own bedroll some distance away, his back to her. There were no leering glances, no cruel jokes about her size, no demands. It was as if her body, the very thing that had earned her such public scorn, was entirely irrelevant to him. This absence of judgment, more than any words, began to chip away at the fortress of shame she had built around herself. She watched him endlessly, the way he meticulously checked his horse's hooves, the economy of his movements when he repacked their sparse supplies, the almost tender way he'd trace a finger over a worn leather strap before tightening it. She learned to anticipate his small gestures, the way he'd point to a distant rock formation signaling a turn, or simply leave a fresh cup of water by her side after a particularly long stretch of riding. She was still afraid, deep down, for her fate remained entirely in his hands. But the fear was slowly morphing into a potent curiosity, a nascent trust. He was not a savior, not in the way she had once dreamed of. He was simply there, a silent, formidable presence who had plucked her from damnation and now led her deeper into the wilderness. One evening, a sudden, violent sandstorm descended upon them. The sky turned a furious orange, the air thick with abrasive grit. Silas, without a moment's hesitation, pulled her from her horse and pressed her against a shallow rock overhang, shielding her with his own body as the storm raged. He held her there, his powerful arm a steel band around her waist, his back absorbing the brunt of the stinging sand. Alara could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back, the warmth radiating from him. In that terrifying, intimate moment, fear gave way to a strange, unfamiliar sense of safety. He was solid, unyielding, a bulwark against the chaos. When the storm finally subsided, leaving a deathly quiet in its wake, he released her, his face grimed with dust, his eyes sweeping the horizon. He offered no apology for the closeness, no explanation for his protective instinct. He simply mounted his horse and waited for her to follow. They rode for 3 more days before they reached his home. It was a small, unassuming cabin, nestled in a sheltered valley, its walls weathered wood, its chimney smoking a thin, inviting wisp. A single, gnarled oak stood sentinel beside it. The sight of it brought a profound, unexpected wave of relief. This was not a prison, not a trap. It was a home, simple and stark, but radiating a quiet resilience that mirrored the man who built it. He dismounted, and for the first time, gestured for her to do the same. As she carefully swung her leg over the saddle, her body still aching, he offered a steadying hand. His touch was brief, firm, and entirely practical. He then turned, disappeared inside the cabin, and re-emerged moments later with a bucket of fresh water. He placed it outside the door along with a clean, rough cloth. He simply nodded towards it, then turned his attention to unsaddling the horses. The message was clear, a chance to wash the journey's grime away. She dipped the cloth into the cool water, scrubbing at the layers of dust and dried tears, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Alara felt a faint stirring of dignity begin to return. Life at the cabin settled into a rhythm defined by the land and the seasons. Silas continued his quiet, methodical existence, tending to his horses, hunting for game, mending fences and chopping wood. Alara, initially unsure of her place, began to contribute. She swept the cabin, cooked the sparse meals over the small fireplace, and learned to patch worn clothes with surprisingly delicate stitches. She learned to read his moods, not through words, but through the subtle shift in his posture, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way he held his axe. He, in turn, seemed to anticipate her needs, leaving a kettle of water on the stove when she woke, or a freshly caught rabbit by the door for her to prepare. One blustery afternoon, as winter began to truly set in, a sudden gust of wind tore a section of the cabin's roof loose. Silas worked tirelessly, battling the wind and the increasingly heavy rain, trying to secure it. Alara watched him from the doorway, her heart aching with a mixture of helplessness and admiration. He was formidable, but even he could be overwhelmed by the elements. Without a word, she grabbed the thickest blankets she could find and began boiling water, preparing hot compresses. When he finally came inside, soaked to the bone and shivering, she simply gestured to the steaming mug of tea and the fire she'd built up. She then knelt and, without asking permission, began to rub warmth back into his stiff, cold hands. He flinched at first, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but then relaxed, allowing her ministrations. In that moment, a barrier fell between them, replaced by a thread of unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of vulnerability and mutual care. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The fattest bride ceased to exist in Alara's mind. She was simply Alara. Her body, once a source of humiliation, was now strong and capable. She could lift heavy water buckets, carry logs, and work tirelessly beside Silas in the small garden patch. He never commented on her size, never looked at her with anything but a steady, calm gaze. She started to realize that the cruelty of Harmony's promise had been about their smallness, not her largeness. It had been about their fear of anything that didn't fit neatly into their expectations. Here, with Silas, she was simply a person, a partner in survival. One evening, while mending a tear in his coat, her fingers brushed against a small, crudely carved wooden bird tucked into the lining. It was worn smooth with handling, undeniably a child's toy. She looked up at Silas, who sat across from her, silently cleaning his rifle. His eyes, usually unreadable, held a deep, ancient sorrow. He didn't speak, but she didn't need him to. The bird, the worn coat, the pervasive quiet that clung to him, it all spoke of loss, of a life once shared, now gone. She understood then that his solitude wasn't a choice, but a consequence of heartbreak. And in that understanding, her affection for him deepened, transforming from a tentative trust into something akin to quiet devotion. The cabin, once a place of uncertain refuge, now felt like a sanctuary, a haven built on silence, shared hardship, and the burgeoning, unspoken language of two solitary souls finding an unexpected connection. The morning dawned crisp and clear, but an unsettling stillness hung in the air. Alara, stepping outside to gather wood, felt the prickle of unease on the back of her neck. It wasn't the wind, nor the chill of the coming winter. It was the absence of sound, the unnatural quiet that preceded trouble. Silas emerged from the cabin, his movements precise, his rifle already in hand. His gaze swept the horizon, then settled on a distant rise. "Riders," he stated, his voice a low rumble. Alara followed his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. 3 figures on horseback, small at first, then growing steadily larger, their intent unmistakable. The men from Harmony's promise. Or perhaps the hired men of the merchant she had refused. Her past, a specter she thought she had outrun, had finally caught up. Fear, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze her. But this time, it was different. This time, she was not alone. Silas moved with a predator's calm, pulling her back into the cabin. He barred the heavy wooden door, secured the shutters. "Stay low," he instructed, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment, a spark of resolve in their depths. Alara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the other rifle he kept above the fireplace, a heavy, old-fashioned Winchester. She'd watched him clean it, had seen him load it countless times. Her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve was firm. She would not be tied to a fence again. She would not be an abomination. She would fight. The riders approached, their shouts echoing across the valley, ugly and triumphant. "We've come for our bride," one bellowed, his voice filled with a chilling menace. "The fat one. No man refuses a good deal." A shot rang out, splintering the wooden wall beside the window. Silas returned fire, his aim precise, forcing them to scatter for cover. Alara watched, loading the second rifle for him with surprising efficiency. Her heart still pounded, but the fear had been replaced by a fierce, protective anger. They were not just after her, but after this quiet life, this fragile sanctuary they had built. She would not let them take it. She heard the crunch of boots on the cabin porch, the splintering of wood as they tried to force the door. "Stand back," Silas muttered, then fired through the door, a guttural cry of pain confirming his shot had found its mark. The attack intensified, a barrage of bullets tearing into the cabin walls. Alara saw a glint of movement outside the side window, a man trying to flank them. Without thinking, she raised the Winchester, took aim as Silas had shown her, and fired. The recoil jolted her shoulder, but the man cried out, clutching his arm, and retreated. A strange exhilaration surged through her. She was no longer just the burden, the one to be protected. She was a participant, a force. The fat bride had found her aim. The siege continued for what felt like an eternity, but Silas and Alara, a silent, formidable team, held them at bay. His stoic strength, her newfound courage, created an unbreakable defense. Eventually, with one of their number wounded and the other two growing desperate, the attackers mounted their horses and retreated, their shouts fading into the distance, this time without triumph. Silence descended once more, but it was a different silence now, one of shared victory. Alara lowered the rifle, her arms trembling from exertion, but her spirit soaring. She looked at Silas. He was leaning against the wall, breathing heavily, a trickle of blood staining his shirt from a graze on his arm. He met her gaze, and for the first time, his eyes held something more than stoicism, a flicker of respect, of quiet pride, and perhaps something deeper, akin to gratitude. He did not speak, but he extended his hand. Alara took it, her fingers intertwining with his rough, calloused ones. It was not a romantic gesture, but a profound, wordless affirmation of their bond. The sun, now climbing high, cast long shadows through the bullet-scarred cabin. Alara walked to the window, looking out at the vast, wild land. She was still a woman of generous proportions, but the shame that had once defined her was gone. It had been burned away by the wind, tempered by shared silence, forged in the crucible of hardship, and ultimately, obliterated by the roar of a rifle in her hands. She was not the fattest bride, she was Alara, a woman who had faced death and found life, who had been cast out and found home, not in the confines of societal expectation, but in the boundless, quiet dignity of her own strength. And beside her, a stoic widower, who had taken her not as a possession, but as a partner, a testament to the unexpected connections that bloom in the harshest of terrains. Their journey had just begun, but they would walk it together, two solitary souls, forever bound by the silent language of resilience and the quiet promise of a future built on shared earth and unspoken trust.